In this video, I'm going to walk you through fixing one of Excel's most annoying features. When you put a value amount in a pivot table and it comes over as a unformatted general type, it can be tempting to fix this problem by just selecting the entire column and giving it a comma. But that is bad practice because you're actually doing that for cells that are outside of the pivot table. And so if you make modifications to the pivot table, you may lose that formatting because the formatting is going with the column, not with the pivot table. So it's always best to do it within the pivot table itself and edit the pivot fields number format rather than the column format. And the manual fix is going to value field settings, number format, choosing number, and choosing that. Well, I'm going to write a macro that does that no matter where you are. And now if you try to use the record macro function on that, it's going to be very static to this particular pivot table. And that's not good. You want a macro that's going to be flexible. So I'm going to do that here. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up my Visual Basic Explorer. I'm going to put this in a macro module that in my tools add-in that I created in a previous video that I will link here. But I'm going to put it in the macros module. I'm going to put it at the bottom, and I'm just going to call it subset pivot field format. Add a few lines, and I'm going to declare all my variables because I want to use some of the IntelliSense that comes with it. So I need a variable for my table, the pivot field, and the range that I'm going to be working with. And the range is just going to be whatever I have selected. So now that I have my variables declared, that's just declaring the variables. It's not actually setting them or using any memory. But for this, I know that my active cell has to be within the pivot table, because if it's not in the pivot table, I'm not going to be able to set the values amount. So this is going to throw a debug error if I am not in the pivot table and I run this macro. So I need to handle that. So I'm going to set on error handling, called on error go to, and I'm just going to call it not in pivot table. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom of the sub and add it here at where it'll actually end up if it reaches this. Because when you turn on error handling, what it means is if there's an error, like an exception, rather than give you a debug, it's going to go to wherever you set it. And so I set it here, it's going to go down here. And essentially, for the most part, you don't need anything here. But I'm going to put debug.print not in pivot table just because I want it to log that I actually ran the macro, but it didn't find the pivot table. Otherwise, if I didn't put anything here, it would just error out and you would just never know. So now I've set up my error handling. Now I'm actually going to take control of the pivot table and set the format. So the first thing I'm going to do is set my range variable to whatever I'm selected as. And that's a universal variable called active cell. So when I set my range to active cell, essentially I'm setting my range to whatever I have selected here. I'm going to set my p table variable to the pivot table. And so every range has a property called pivot table. So if it's part of a pivot table, it'll actually reference that pivot table. If it doesn't, this is where it'll error out. So if I'm over here not outside the pivot table and I tried to set it as that, this value is actually going to be nothing and it's going to throw a debug error. And since I have error handling on, it'll just come down here. But if I didn't have error handling on, you would get a debug error. And so the last, I need to set my p field value equal to p table dot pivot fields, because now I have the pivot table. Well, the pivot table is made up of the fields, and I'm going to just say range dot pivot field dot name. And so what that does is I'm setting my variable equal to the pivot table's pivot field, and it needs a name. Well, the name over here is going to be sum of amount, but I don't know that until I get to this, because the range has that pivot field name in the properties of it. And so I'm going to pull that table's field. So now I have that set as that variable. Now I can use that variable's property to set my number format. And so this is what I'll do here. I'll just say pfield.number format, and this is where I'll set it to whatever I want it. I'm come from accounting, so I like the 2 decimals and I like the space after it. And then I even like red and in parentheses. So I just put those there. So now that I've got my macro all written, there's only one last thing to do. Because you've turned on error handling, so it'll skip to here. Well, if it actually goes through without an error too, it'll also do this as well. And so I want it to actually exit out if it reaches this. If it reaches this successfully, quit from here. And that's it. So that's the entire macro. It's very simple. And so every time you're in a pivot table, you can quickly run this and get the number. So just to show you, click play. It formatted my pivot table so I can actually see my numbers how I want them. And so now that I have it as part of my tools, I can come up here and add it to my quick access toolbar like I did in the previous video. And I can say set pivot field format, modify, just give it a different name. And let's just choose this icon, click OK. So now if I'm going to create another pivot table, let's just drag, let's do description, and then amount. And so you can see that it's, again, not formatted very easily to read. I just click my button, and there you have it. It's got my pivot fields all formatted correctly for me. I hope you found this video useful. Please like and subscribe it. And drop in the comments any of those things that you waste your time on, that you with the same clicks over and over and over again. I'd be glad to try to help you find the ways to automate those, because this is what I like doing. I worked in accounting for the longest time, and this pivot table thing is definitely an accountant's nightmare. So I'd be glad to help you automate those things that you need.